The moment I saw the name tag, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Weddings are supposed to make people feel welcome, not singled out, and certainly not embarrassed. Yet there I was, standing at the entrance of my own granddaughter's wedding reception, holding a small white card with a gold ribbon clipped to it. The words printed neatly in black ink read, "The old lady who's paying for everything." For a few seconds, I simply stared at it, waiting for the punchline that never came. Around me, guests were arriving in elegant dresses and tailored suits, greeting each other with cheerful hugs while a violin quartet played softly from the corner of the vineyard terrace. Crystal glasses clinked, servers carried trays of sparkling cider and champagne, and the late afternoon sun painted the California hills in warm shades of gold. Everything about the place looked like it belonged in a glossy wedding magazine, except for the strange little label now pinned to my jacket. I adjusted my coat and glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed. A few guests were already reading their own name tags and chatting easily, but none of them seemed to have anything unusual written on theirs. Most said simple things like cousin of the bride, college friend, or neighbor. Mine was the only one that felt less like an introduction and more like a quiet joke someone expected everyone else to understand. I let out a slow breath and reminded myself that today wasn't about me. Today was about Emily, my granddaughter, the little girl who used to sit at my kitchen table eating pancakes shaped like stars while telling me she wanted the biggest wedding in the world one day. Back then she had been 7 years old, her blonde pigtails bouncing every time she laughed. Now she was 26 and marrying a successful young architect named Daniel in a vineyard that rented for more money per hour than my first house had cost. I walked further into the reception area, careful not to spill the cider someone had just handed me. The place was breathtaking. Long wooden tables stretched across the lawn under strings of glowing lights. White roses and eucalyptus branches decorated every centerpiece. Even the chairs were wrapped in soft linen ribbons. I overheard one guest whisper that the venue alone probably cost more than $50,000 for the evening. Another person joked that the flower arrangements must have come straight from a celebrity wedding planner. Listening to them, I couldn't help smiling a little. They weren't wrong. Every detail had been carefully chosen. Every bill had been paid. I gently touched the edge of the name tag again, still unsure whether it had been meant as humor or something else entirely. Just then, my daughter Karen approached from across the patio, her heels clicking against the stone walkway as she hurried over. She looked elegant in a deep green dress, though her expression carried the familiar tension she often wore when organizing events like this. "Mom, you made it," she said quickly, giving me a brief hug before glancing toward the entrance where more guests were arriving. "The ceremony starts in about 20 minutes. I nodded and smiled. "It's beautiful, Karen. You and Emily did a wonderful job." She seemed relieved to hear that and started to say something else, but her attention was already drifting toward the catering staff arranging dessert plates nearby. As she turned to leave, her eyes briefly landed on the tag pinned to my jacket. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition. But before I could ask about it, she simply gave a tight smile and said, "I'll catch up with you after the ceremony," then disappeared back into the crowd. I watched her walk away, my fingers still resting on the strange little card. Maybe it was just a joke someone thought was clever. Maybe Emily's friends had been responsible. Weddings, after all, sometimes came with silly games and quirky name tags meant to break the ice. But as the music swelled and the guests began taking their seats facing the flower-covered arch at the far end of the vineyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that the message on my chest wasn't meant to be funny at all. And the more I thought about those words, the more I realized something that made the evening feel very different than it had just a few minutes earlier. Because whether anyone else understood that sentence or not, one thing about it was absolutely true. I was paying for everything. And before this wedding night was over, everyone there was going to understand exactly what that meant. The ceremony itself was as beautiful as anyone could have imagined. Guests sat in neat rows of white chairs facing the wooden arch covered in white roses and eucalyptus, the vineyard stretching out behind it in gentle green hills. The late afternoon sun had softened into that warm golden light photographer's love, and a quiet breeze moved through the leaves as the violin quartet began playing a slow, familiar melody. I took a seat in the third row, close enough to see Emily clearly but far enough that I wouldn't be in the middle of all the cameras. As people settled around me, I noticed the occasional glance drifting toward my chest. Some guests probably assumed the words on my name tag were meant as a playful introduction, but the longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable it felt. The phrase didn't just sound like a joke. It sounded like a label someone had decided fit me perfectly. When the music changed and everyone stood, Emily appeared at the end of the aisle on her father's arm. For a moment, all the strange thoughts left my mind. She looked radiant in a long white dress with delicate lace sleeves, the kind she used to point at in bridal magazines years ago when she was still in college. Her smile was bright and excited, the way a bride's smile should be, and the crowd let out a quiet murmur of admiration as she walked slowly forward. I watched her carefully, remembering the little girl who used to run through my backyard chasing butterflies during summer visits. Back then she never cared about expensive dresses or fancy venues. She just liked sitting on the porch swing with a glass of lemonade while telling me about her dreams. The ceremony lasted about 20 minutes. The officiant spoke about family and commitment, about how weddings bring together not just two people but generations of love and support. I noticed that line because several guests glanced toward the rows where relatives were sitting. When Emily and Daniel exchanged their vows, the crowd applauded warmly. Cameras flashed, the violin music swelled again, and just like that they were married. Afterward everyone moved toward the reception lawn where the long wooden tables waited under strings of soft lights. Servers began offering drinks and small appetizers while the newlyweds posed for photos among the vines. I wandered slowly toward one of the tables, still thinking about the name tag pinned to my jacket. A group of Emily's friends stood nearby laughing about something on their phones. One of them looked up at me briefly, read the card on my chest, and raised her eyebrows before whispering something to the others. They didn't say anything rude out loud, but their amused smiles made it clear they understood the message printed there. I tried not to take it personally. Weddings were full of small moments that could be misunderstood. Still, the words sat there like a quiet reminder every time someone looked at me. A few minutes later my daughter Karen returned, this time carrying a clipboard and speaking quickly with the wedding coordinator. "Everything running on schedule?" the coordinator asked. Karen nodded. "Yes, the catering is set for 7 and the speeches start right after dinner." As they spoke, Karen glanced toward me again, her eyes lingering briefly on the name tag before she looked away. Something about that reaction told me she knew exactly where it had come from. The sun dipped lower behind the hills as the reception lights flickered on, casting a warm glow across the tables and dance floor. Music began playing softly through hidden speakers while guests took their seats for dinner. I sat quietly, listening to the conversations around me about the beautiful venue, the expensive flowers, and the perfect weather. Everyone kept mentioning how generous the family must have been to host such a remarkable celebration. Hearing that made me smile faintly. Because while most of the guests were admiring the decorations and the wine, none of them had any idea how this wedding had actually come together. And judging by the way a few people kept glancing at the name tag pinned to my jacket, someone in this family thought the story behind it would stay a private joke. But before the night was over, that little card was going to mean something very different to everyone sitting at those tables. Dinner began just as the last streaks of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, leaving the vineyard glowing under rows of soft string lights. Guests filled the long wooden tables, their voices blending with the quiet music drifting from the speakers. Plates of roasted vegetables, grilled salmon, and fresh bread were passed around while glasses of wine were refilled again and again. From where I sat near the center of the lawn, I could see almost the entire reception. Emily and Daniel were seated at the sweetheart table under a small canopy of white roses, smiling as friends and relatives stopped by to congratulate them. Every now and then Emily would laugh at something someone said, the sound bright and carefree, the way a bride's laughter should be on her wedding night. Watching her like that made it easy to remember the years before everything became so complicated. When she was younger, Emily used to call me every Sunday afternoon just to tell me about her week. Sometimes the conversations lasted 5 minutes, sometimes an hour, but she always ended them the same way. She would say, "Thanks, Grandma. You always know how to make things feel simpler." Those calls had become less frequent after she moved to the city for work. Life moved faster there, and new people filled her time. Still, when she called last year to say Daniel had proposed, her voice carried that same excitement I remembered from when she was a child. She had told me she wanted a beautiful wedding but wasn't sure how they could afford the kind she imagined. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table that evening, looking at the stack of envelopes and documents I had carefully organized over the years. Saving money had always been my quiet habit. I never spent much on myself, preferring small routines like gardening, reading on the porch, or baking for neighbors. Over time, those small savings added up more than most people realized. When Emily described the vineyard venue she loved, the one that rented for thousands of dollars just for the ceremony space, I heard the hesitation in her voice. She tried to sound practical, saying maybe they would settle for something simpler. That was the moment I told her she didn't need to worry about it. I had simply said, every bride deserves the wedding she dreams about. At first she thought I was joking. Then when she realized I was serious, she began to cry in that quiet way people do when they feel both grateful and overwhelmed. I told her it wasn't a loan and it wasn't something she had to repay. It was a gift. Family helps family when it matters. Thinking about that conversation now, sitting at this elegant table surrounded by glowing lights and expensive decorations, made the words on my name tag feel heavier than they had earlier. I glanced down at the small white card again. The phrase printed on it still looked exactly the same, calm and simple, as if it were nothing more than a description. Across the table, a couple from Daniel's side of the family were admiring the centerpieces and discussing how rare it was to see a wedding organized on such a scale. One of them said, "Whoever paid for this must really love that girl." I smiled politely but didn't say anything. At the sweetheart table, Daniel stood and tapped his glass gently with a spoon. The soft ringing sound traveled across the lawn and slowly quieted the conversations around us. "All right, everyone," he said with an easy smile, "we're about to start the speeches." Guests turned their chairs toward the small stage set beside the dance floor where a microphone had been placed under the lights. I watched as Emily squeezed his hand and laughed nervously, clearly excited for what came next. The first person approaching the microphone was my daughter Karen. She adjusted the paper in her hand and glanced over the crowd, looking confident the way she always did when speaking in front of people. For a brief moment her eyes landed on me again. This time she didn't look away immediately. Her gaze dropped to the name tag pinned to my jacket, and something in her expression shifted before she stepped fully into the light. As she lifted the microphone and prepared to begin her speech, I suddenly had the quiet feeling that the story everyone believed about this wedding might not stay that simple for much longer. Karen adjusted the microphone and smiled out at the crowd, the string lights above the dance floor casting a soft glow over everyone's faces. Conversations faded until the only sound left was the quiet hum of the speakers and the distant rustle of the vineyard leaves. She cleared her throat lightly and began the way most mothers do at their daughter's wedding, talking about how quickly time passes and how proud she felt watching Emily grow into the woman she had become. Guests nodded and smiled, some holding up their phones to record the moment. Karen spoke about Emily's kindness, her determination in college, and how she always seemed to know exactly what she wanted from life. When she mentioned Daniel, she joked about the first time he came to dinner and how nervous he had looked sitting at the kitchen table. The crowd laughed politely, and Emily covered her face with her hands for a second before laughing too. From the outside, it sounded like a perfect speech, the kind people expect to hear during a celebration like this. Yet as Karen continued talking, I began to notice the way she carefully chose her words. She thanked friends for helping with decorations, thanked Daniel's family for traveling so far, and even thanked the wedding planner who had organized the evening. But there was one small detail she seemed to move around instead of directly addressing. Several guests had already mentioned it earlier in the evening, the same way people do when they admire something expensive. They kept saying how generous it must have been for someone to make such a wedding possible. Karen paused for a moment and glanced down at her paper, as if deciding how to continue. Then she smiled again and said, "Of course, weddings like this don't happen without a lot of support." A few people nodded, expecting her to explain. Instead, she shifted the topic back to Emily's childhood stories, and the crowd relaxed again, laughing at memories about dance recitals and school plays. I sat quietly, listening while occasionally noticing someone's eyes drifting toward the name tag pinned to my jacket. Under the lights, the words were easy to read even from a few feet away. "The old lady who's paying for everything." A young man seated near me leaned closer to the woman beside him and whispered something while glancing at the card. She raised her eyebrows slightly, clearly amused by whatever conclusion they had reached. I didn't blame them for being curious. After all, the message sounded like a joke someone had written for entertainment. But for me, it felt more like a reminder of a conversation that had taken place almost a year earlier in my small kitchen. That evening Emily and Karen had both been there, sitting across from me with cups of coffee as we discussed the wedding plans. The venue deposit alone had been nearly $15,000, and the catering estimate looked even higher. Karen had tried to explain that maybe the guest list needed to shrink or the location should change. Emily looked heartbroken at the idea. I remember placing my hand gently on the table and telling them not to worry about it. I had spent decades setting money aside little by little, not because I wanted anything extravagant but because I believed family should have security when important moments arrived. That was the night I offered to cover the wedding. I never asked for recognition. In fact, I specifically told them I preferred things to stay simple. I only wanted Emily to have the day she dreamed about. Back at the reception, Karen's speech finally came to an end with a warm toast to the bride and groom. Guests raised their glasses, applauding as she stepped away from the microphone. The music started again and conversations quickly returned to the cheerful rhythm of a celebration. But as Karen walked past my table on her way back to her seat, she paused for a brief second beside me. Her eyes dropped once more to the name tag on my jacket. This time there was no quick smile, no attempt to pretend it was just a harmless joke. Instead she looked slightly uneasy, like someone who suddenly realized a small detail might grow into a much larger moment before the night was over. And as the next speaker stood up and approached the microphone, I began to suspect that moment was closer than anyone expected. The next speaker turned out to be Daniel's best friend, a tall man named Mark who looked both excited and slightly nervous as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd welcomed him with light applause, and he began with the usual jokes about college memories and late-night study sessions that were probably less about studying and more about pizza and bad decisions. Guests laughed easily, and even Daniel shook his head with a smile, clearly used to hearing these stories. Mark had a natural way of speaking that kept everyone relaxed, and within a few minutes the entire lawn felt warmer and lighter again. Still, every now and then I noticed his eyes wandering across the audience the way people do when they're trying to include everyone in the room. At one point his gaze landed on my table and paused just long enough for him to read the words printed on my name tag. For a brief second his eyebrows lifted in confusion, but then he continued speaking as if nothing had happened. I lowered my eyes to the card again, tracing the edge of it with my fingers. The small gold ribbon holding it in place looked decorative and cheerful, almost festive, which made the sentence printed above it feel even stranger. The old lady who's paying for everything. Whoever had written it had done so neatly, like it was meant to sound clever rather than cruel. Across the lawn, the catering staff quietly cleared empty plates and replaced them with small dessert trays filled with miniature cakes and berries. Guests leaned closer together while they listened to the speech, their faces glowing softly in the warm light. Mark finished by raising his glass and wishing Emily and Daniel a lifetime of patience, laughter, and partnership. Everyone clapped again, and the music resumed for a few minutes while the microphone was prepared for the next toast. I noticed Karen standing near the edge of the stage speaking quietly with the wedding coordinator. She looked a little distracted, glancing around as if checking whether everything was still running according to schedule. For a moment her eyes found me again across the tables. She held my gaze longer this time before looking down toward the small white card on my jacket. Something about that look felt almost apologetic, though she said nothing. The next speaker approached the microphone, and a ripple of excitement moved through the crowd when people realized it was Emily herself. The bride lifted her dress slightly as she stepped onto the small platform, laughing nervously while Daniel handed her the microphone. "I wasn't planning to give a speech," she admitted, her voice bright and slightly shaky with emotion. "But looking around tonight, I just feel so grateful." Guests responded with soft applause, and Emily took a moment to look across the sea of faces illuminated by the vineyard lights. She began thanking friends who had helped organize bridal showers, coworkers who had supported her during stressful weeks of planning, and Daniel's family for welcoming her so warmly. Her voice carried easily through the speakers, clear and full of happiness. As she continued speaking, I noticed something that made me sit a little straighter in my chair. Emily's eyes slowly moved from table to table, acknowledging different groups of guests. When her gaze finally reached mine, it paused there for just a moment. I couldn't tell whether she had noticed the words on my name tag yet, but something in her expression shifted slightly as if she were remembering something important. The music had faded completely now, leaving the vineyard quiet except for her voice. She took a slow breath and continued speaking about the people who had helped make the wedding possible. Listening to her words, I realized the moment everyone had been circling around all evening was beginning to arrive. Because sooner or later, someone standing at that microphone was going to mention the one person who had quietly made sure this entire celebration could happen. And when that moment came, the small sentence printed on the card, pinned to my jacket, was going to mean far more than anyone in that audience currently understood. Emily held the microphone with both hands for a moment, smiling out at the crowd as if she were trying to gather her thoughts. The vineyard had grown very quiet, the way large gatherings sometimes do when everyone senses that something meaningful is about to be said. Soft lights glowed above the tables, reflecting in the glasses and silverware while a warm evening breeze moved gently through the vines behind the stage. Emily laughed softly and said, "I promise I won't keep everyone too long. I just wanted to say thank you to the people who helped make today possible." Guests leaned back in their chairs, relaxed and attentive, the kind of comfortable silence that only happens when people are enjoying themselves. She began by thanking her friends who had traveled from different states to be there. Some had flown in from as far as New York and Texas, and she joked about how they had survived long flights just to watch her cry during the ceremony. The crowd laughed with her, and the mood remained light and joyful. Then she turned toward Daniel and spoke about the way he had supported her through the months of planning, especially during the stressful weeks when guest lists changed and schedules became complicated. Daniel grinned and raised his glass, earning another round of applause. For a few seconds Emily looked down at the stage floor, almost like she was deciding what to say next. When she lifted her head again, her eyes slowly scanned across the tables. I noticed the moment she saw me clearly. Her gaze lingered just long enough for her to read the name tag pinned to my jacket. From where I sat, I could see the small flicker of surprise cross her face. It was subtle, but it was there. She paused in the middle of her sentence, and for a second the microphone picked up nothing but the quiet hum of the speakers. Emily blinked once and then let out a small laugh, though it sounded more uncertain than amused. "Well," she said slowly, "I guess I should probably thank the person who really made tonight possible." Several guests nodded, expecting to hear a sponsor mentioned or perhaps a family member recognized. Emily shifted her weight slightly and looked toward the rows of tables again. Her eyes moved over the guests until they returned to me. "My grandmother," she said, her voice a little softer now, "has always been someone who believes family should show up for each other." I felt dozens of heads turning at once. Some guests followed her gaze across the lawn until their attention settled on my table. The words on my name tag were suddenly much easier for everyone to read. Emily continued speaking, explaining how the wedding had started as a simple plan but quickly grew into something much bigger. She admitted that when the costs began rising, she and Daniel had both worried about whether they could afford the celebration she dreamed about. "And that's when my grandma told us not to worry," Emily said, smiling faintly now as the memory returned. "She said that some moments in life are worth celebrating properly." A gentle murmur spread across the crowd as people began connecting the details. The vineyard venue, the decorations, the catering, the music. All the things guests had admired throughout the evening. Emily lifted her hand slightly and pointed toward me. "She never asked for recognition," she added. "In fact, she told us she didn't want any attention at all." I could feel the weight of dozens of curious glances resting on my shoulders now. Some people looked surprised. Others looked impressed. But a few guests, the ones who had earlier whispered about my name tag, looked suddenly uncertain. Emily tilted her head slightly as if noticing something she hadn't seen before. Her eyes dropped again to the card pinned to my jacket. From the stage, the words were impossible to miss under the warm reception lights. She squinted slightly, trying to read them clearly. Then her smile faded just a little. The silence across the vineyard grew heavier, the kind that arrives when people realize a small detail might carry a much bigger meaning than anyone expected. And as Emily leaned closer to the microphone again, it became clear that the next thing she said would change the tone of the entire evening. Emily leaned slightly closer to the microphone, her eyes still fixed on the small card pinned to my jacket. The vineyard was so quiet that even the soft clink of a glass somewhere in the crowd sounded louder than usual. For a moment she didn't speak, and the guests followed her gaze until more and more of them noticed the words written on my name tag. From the stage, the sentence was impossible to ignore under the warm lights. I saw a few people tilt their heads, trying to read it clearly, while others had already figured it out and were exchanging puzzled looks with the people beside them. Emily gave a small confused laugh and said into the microphone, "Okay. I might need someone to explain something to me." The crowd responded with a ripple of light chuckles, thinking perhaps she was joking, but her expression remained thoughtful rather than playful. She lifted one hand slightly and pointed toward me again. "Grandma," she said gently, "would you mind standing up for a second?" I felt dozens of eyes turn toward my table at once. Slowly, I pushed my chair back and stood. The lights from the reception canopy reflected softly off the glasses and plates around me while the guests closest to my table leaned slightly to the side so they could see better. Emily squinted again toward my chest and then read the card out loud, her voice careful and uncertain. "The old lady who's paying for everything." The words hung in the air for a moment longer than anyone expected. A few guests laughed awkwardly, unsure whether it had been meant as humor. Others simply looked around the lawn as if waiting for someone to explain the joke. Emily lowered the microphone slightly and shook her head. "I don't remember approving that name tag," she said slowly. Her eyes moved across the crowd, searching for a familiar face. Daniel leaned closer to her and whispered something, but she shook her head again and continued speaking. "If this was supposed to be funny, I think the person who wrote it might want to rethink that idea." The tone of the evening shifted just a little. Not dramatically, but enough that people stopped smiling quite so casually. Karen, standing near the stage with the wedding coordinator, looked suddenly very still. Even from across the lawn I could see the tension in her shoulders. Emily glanced down at the microphone and then back toward me. "My grandmother has always been the quietest person in our family," she said. "She's the one who listens more than she talks, and somehow she always ends up helping everyone else solve their problems." Several guests nodded politely, though many of them were still glancing between the stage and my name tag. Emily smiled faintly and continued. "When Daniel and I started planning this wedding, we had no idea how expensive everything would become. We honestly thought we might have to scale the whole thing down." She gestured toward the vineyard around us, the long tables, the lights, the decorations. But my grandma stepped in and told us not to worry. She said if this was the day we dreamed about, then we should celebrate it properly. The murmurs around the tables grew a little louder now as people absorbed what she was saying. Emily lowered the microphone slightly again and added, "So yes, technically the sentence on that name tag is true." A few surprised smiles appeared across the crowd, though the humor still felt uncertain. Emily paused and then looked toward Karen again. "But the way it's written makes it sound like a joke," she continued. "And I don't think the person who made tonight possible should be introduced like that." The silence that followed was different from before. This time it wasn't just anticipation. It carried the weight of curiosity and quiet discomfort spreading through the guests. Karen took a small step forward as if she might say something, but then stopped. Emily noticed the movement immediately. Her expression softened slightly, but there was also a clear determination in her voice when she spoke again. "Actually," she said, looking out over the crowd, "I think we should figure out exactly where that name tag came from." And in that moment, it became clear that the small white card pinned to my jacket had just turned into the most important detail of the entire evening. Emily's words settled over the vineyard like a sudden shift in the evening air. Guests who had been leaning back comfortably in their chairs were now sitting a little straighter, their attention focused entirely on the stage. The soft music that had been playing earlier remained silent, and the only sound was the quiet rustling of leaves from the vineyard behind us. Emily held the microphone close but didn't speak immediately. She looked from table to table as if trying to read the expressions of the people gathered there. Many of them had already begun whispering to the person beside them, the kind of hushed conversations that happen when something unexpected interrupts a celebration. Daniel stepped closer to Emily and murmured something quietly near her ear. She nodded once, but her eyes were still scanning the crowd. Then she spoke again, her voice calm but clear. "I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable," she said. "I just think if someone made a joke about my grandmother tonight, we should probably understand why." A few guests smiled politely, though most were still unsure how to react. From across the lawn I could see Karen standing near the edge of the stage with her arms folded lightly in front of her. She wasn't smiling anymore. The wedding coordinator beside her shifted awkwardly, glancing between Karen and the microphone like someone who wished the evening would return to its original schedule. Emily lowered the microphone slightly and looked directly at her mother. "Mom," she said gently, "do you know anything about the name tags?" Karen hesitated just long enough for several guests to notice. She stepped forward a little, forcing a small smile as she reached the stage. When she spoke, her voice carried through the speakers but sounded tighter than before. "They were just meant to be lighthearted," she explained. "A little icebreaker so guests could recognize how they're connected to the family." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Right," she said slowly, "but everyone else's tag says things like cousin or friend or neighbor." A few people in the audience glanced down at their own tags again, confirming exactly what she meant. Karen cleared her throat and tried to keep her tone casual. "Well, your grandmother has always been the one helping everyone in the family. I thought it would be a playful way to acknowledge that." The explanation hung in the air for a moment. Some guests nodded uncertainly, but others looked toward me again, reading the sentence more carefully than they had earlier. Emily didn't speak right away. She seemed to be thinking about something, her eyes still resting on the small card pinned to my jacket. Then she lifted the microphone again and said quietly, "I understand the idea of a joke. But that one doesn't really feel like a compliment." A few people shifted in their seats, the tension now impossible to ignore. Karen's smile faded slightly, though she still tried to maintain a calm expression. "Emily, it's not a big deal," she said gently. "Everyone knows how much your grandmother loves helping the family." I remained standing beside my table, listening without interrupting. The lights above the reception lawn cast a soft glow across the guests, and from where I stood I could see many of them studying Karen now instead of me. Emily looked out over the crowd again before speaking. That's exactly my point, she said. Grandma helps everyone because she cares. Not because she's supposed to. Her voice softened at the last sentence, but the meaning behind it was clear enough. A quiet murmur spread across the lawn as people began piecing together the situation for themselves. The expensive venue, the elaborate decorations, the generous catering. All of it suddenly had a story attached to it. Emily lowered the microphone slightly and looked at me again. Grandma, she said warmly, I think everyone here deserves to know something. She paused for a second, letting the attention settle fully on her words. Then she lifted the microphone again and continued, My grandmother didn't just help with this wedding. She made it possible. The murmurs grew louder now, spreading across the tables like ripples across water. Several guests turned to each other with surprised expressions, clearly realizing the scale of what Emily meant. And as those reactions moved through the crowd, the small sentence printed on the card pinned to my jacket began to feel very different from the way it had earlier that evening. The murmurs that followed Emily's words spread slowly across the reception lawn. Guests leaned toward each other, whispering quietly as they began to understand what she meant. A few people glanced again at the decorations, the glowing lights strung across the vineyard, the long tables covered with linen and flowers. Suddenly those details looked different, as if they carried a story no one had fully noticed before. Emily remained standing at the microphone, watching the reactions move through the crowd. Daniel stood beside her with one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, his expression calm but thoughtful. Karen, however, looked far less comfortable. She stood near the stage with her arms loosely crossed, her eyes shifting between Emily and me. Emily lifted the microphone again and continued speaking, her voice warm but steady. When Daniel and I started planning this wedding, she said, we had a lot of ideas and a very small budget. A few guests chuckled softly, recognizing the familiar challenge that comes with planning any big event. We looked at smaller venues, simpler decorations, shorter guest lists, she went on. But every time we tried to change the plan, it felt like we were giving up pieces of the day we imagined. She paused briefly and looked toward me again, her expression filled with quiet gratitude. Then my grandmother told us something I'll never forget, she said. She said that some memories deserve to be celebrated properly, especially when they bring family together. The crowd listened carefully now, the earlier laughter replaced by attentive silence. Emily explained how the conversation had taken place nearly a year earlier in my small kitchen, when the reality of the wedding costs first became clear. She described how Daniel and she had worried about the expenses, how they had tried to find ways to reduce everything so it would fit their budget. But Grandma stopped us before we could even finish the conversation, Emily said. She told us she had been saving money for years, not for herself, but for moments like this. The words moved gently through the audience, and several guests nodded in quiet appreciation. Emily gestured toward the vineyard around us. The venue, the catering, the music, the decorations, all of it happened because she believed family should support each other when it matters most. I could see people turning toward me now with very different expressions than earlier in the evening. The curious smiles had disappeared. In their place were looks of respect and surprise. Emily lowered the microphone slightly, her eyes still resting on the name tag pinned to my jacket. So yes, she continued softly, the sentence on that card technically tells the truth. A few light chuckles returned to the crowd, though they carried a much different tone now. But the way it's written doesn't really explain the whole story. Karen shifted her weight slightly near the stage, clearly aware that the attention had moved in a direction she hadn't expected. Emily looked back toward the guests again. My grandmother never wanted recognition for any of this, she said. In fact, she asked us not to make a big announcement tonight. She smiled faintly at that memory. But when I saw the words on that tag, I realized something. If people are going to talk about who paid for the wedding, they should probably understand why she chose to do it. The vineyard remained completely silent now, every guest listening carefully. Emily took a slow breath and continued. She didn't do it to show off. She didn't do it because anyone expected her to. She did it because she believes family should celebrate each other, even if it takes years of quiet saving to make that moment happen. As her words settled over the crowd, the atmosphere of the evening shifted again, this time in a warmer direction. Several guests began clapping softly, the applause growing slowly from one table to another. And while the sound of that appreciation spread across the vineyard, I noticed something else happening near the stage. Karen was looking at the small card on my jacket again, but this time her expression wasn't defensive or uneasy. It looked more like the realization that the meaning behind those few printed words had just become far more powerful than she ever expected. The applause that followed Emily's words lasted longer than anyone expected. It began as a few polite claps from the nearest tables, but within seconds it spread across the entire vineyard until nearly every guest was applauding. The sound carried warmly through the evening air, echoing softly between the rows of grapevines and the string lights glowing above the reception tables. Emily stood quietly beside the microphone, clearly a little overwhelmed by the response. Daniel leaned closer to her and whispered something that made her smile before she gently raised her hand, signaling that she had one more thing to say. The applause slowly faded, though the atmosphere remained different now. The earlier curiosity had been replaced by something calmer and far more respectful. Emily glanced toward me again before speaking. "My grandmother didn't plan on being part of tonight's speeches," she said with a soft laugh. "She actually warned me not to embarrass her in front of everyone." Several guests chuckled, and I felt my cheeks warm slightly as the attention returned to my table. Emily continued, her tone thoughtful. "But I think there's something important people should understand. The money she saved wasn't just sitting in an account waiting for a wedding. It came from years of choices." The crowd listened closely as she explained how I had worked quietly for decades, setting aside small amounts whenever I could. She described how I often skipped vacations, how I reused things instead of replacing them, and how I always believed that one day those savings would help someone in the family when it mattered most. "She never talked about it," Emily said. "Most of us didn't even know how carefully she had planned for the future." A few guests nodded knowingly, recognizing that kind of quiet sacrifice in their own families. Emily looked briefly toward the head table where Karen still stood, then back at the audience. "Tonight was supposed to be about Daniel and me," she continued. "But the truth is, this celebration represents something bigger than just our wedding." She paused for a moment, letting the words settle. "It represents the idea that family support doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like years of patience, small decisions, and believing that love can grow into something meaningful over time." The vineyard remained completely silent again as everyone listened. Emily lowered the microphone slightly and turned toward me with a gentle smile. "Grandma, I know you didn't want attention tonight," she said. "But I hope you'll forgive me for saying this." I could see her eyes glistening slightly under the warm lights as she continued. "Everything we're celebrating today exists because you believed in us long before we believed in ourselves." For a moment I didn't know how to react. I had never been comfortable standing in front of crowds, and now every pair of eyes seemed to be focused on me. But before I could think of anything to say, Daniel stepped forward beside Emily and added quietly, "And because of that belief, we promise to build a family that honors it." Another round of applause began, softer this time but filled with genuine warmth. As the clapping spread across the tables again, I noticed Karen slowly approaching from the side of the stage. She stopped a few steps away, her posture noticeably more hesitant than before. Her eyes briefly met mine, then shifted down toward the name tag still pinned to my jacket. For the first time that evening, her expression looked thoughtful rather than confident. And as the applause slowly faded again under the glowing lights of the vineyard, it became clear that the small card with those surprising words had changed the entire tone of the night in a way none of us could have predicted. Karen remained standing a few steps from the stage, clearly unsure whether she should say something or simply return to her table. The warm glow of the string lights reflected off the polished wooden floor of the reception platform, and for a moment the entire vineyard seemed to hold a quiet pause. Emily and Daniel stepped slightly away from the microphone to give the band time to prepare for the next part of the evening, but many of the guests were still looking in my direction with gentle smiles. I had attended many family celebrations over the years, but I had never expected to become the center of attention at my own granddaughter's wedding. Slowly, I stood from my chair, adjusting the small name tag on my jacket almost out of habit. The card still read the same words that had surprised me earlier in the evening, but now the meaning behind them felt very different. As I stood there, Karen took a few cautious steps closer. Her confident posture from earlier had softened, and when she spoke, her voice was noticeably quieter. "I think I owe you an apology," she said, glancing briefly at the card before meeting my eyes again. I smiled gently, not wanting the moment to become uncomfortable for either of us. "Weddings can make people nervous," I replied lightly. "Everyone wants everything to be perfect." Karen nodded slowly, clearly relieved that I hadn't responded with any frustration. When we were organizing the seating and name tags, she continued, "I thought it would be funny. Just a small joke for the family tables." She paused, then added honestly, "But I didn't realize how it might sound." The music from the band began softly in the background as guests started to return to their conversations, but Karen and I remained near the edge of the stage. I could see Emily watching us from across the lawn, her expression calm and hopeful. "The truth is," Karen said after a moment, "tonight reminded me that sometimes the people who give the most are the ones who talk about it the least." I nodded slowly, appreciating the sincerity in her voice. "That's usually how families work," I said. "Most of the important things happen quietly." Karen glanced once more at the name tag and gave a small smile. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think everyone here understands the real meaning now." I looked out across the vineyard as guests began moving toward the dance floor, the lights glowing softly above them. Laughter and music filled the evening air again, and the tension that had briefly passed through the celebration earlier had completely disappeared. Emily and Daniel stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance, surrounded by friends and relatives who were clapping along with the music. As the couple slowly began their dance under the lights, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle in. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, but somehow it had revealed something far more meaningful than any perfect decoration or carefully planned detail. Families, I realized, are rarely defined by the small misunderstandings that happen along the way. Instead, they are shaped by the way people choose to support each other when it matters most. And as I watched my granddaughter smiling beside her new husband, surrounded by the people who loved them, it became clear that this wedding would be remembered not for a name tag or an awkward moment, but for the reminder that kindness and generosity have a way of bringing everyone back together. The music for Emily and Daniel's first dance drifted gently across the vineyard, carried by the warm evening air and the soft glow of the lights hanging above the reception. Guests formed a wide circle around the dance floor, many of them smiling quietly as they watched the newly married couple move slowly together. I remained near the edge of the lawn, my hands folded loosely in front of me, taking in the scene with a sense of calm I hadn't expected earlier in the evening. Just a few hours before, I had arrived at this same celebration feeling like a quiet observer, hoping simply to enjoy the moment and watch my granddaughter begin a new chapter of her life. Instead, the night had unfolded in a way none of us could have predicted. My fingers brushed lightly against the small card still pinned to my jacket. The words printed on it were the same ones that had caused such confusion earlier, "The old lady who's paying for everything." When I first read them, I had been surprised and a little embarrassed, unsure whether the phrase was meant as a joke or something else entirely. But as I stood there now watching Emily and Daniel laugh softly while they danced, the words no longer felt uncomfortable. If anything, they seemed to represent a story that had quietly unfolded over many years. I remembered the small kitchen table where Emily had first told me she was worried about the cost of her wedding. She had tried to sound practical at the time, explaining that she and Daniel were considering a very simple ceremony because they didn't want to begin their marriage with financial stress. I could still hear the hesitation in her voice as she spoke, the way she tried to hide her disappointment behind careful words. That was the moment I realized the savings I had quietly built over the years finally had a purpose. They weren't meant to sit untouched forever. They were meant to help create moments that would stay with the family long after the numbers in a bank account stopped mattering. The music shifted to a slightly livelier tune as Emily and Daniel's dance came to an end, and the guests applauded warmly before joining them on the floor. Laughter returned to the vineyard as more couples stepped forward, and the celebration quickly regained the relaxed energy that weddings are meant to have. Emily eventually made her way through the crowd and wrapped her arms around me in a long, grateful hug. "Thank you for everything, Grandma," she whispered softly. I smiled and squeezed her hand. "All I did was help start the party," I replied gently. "The rest of the memories are up to you." She laughed at that and returned to the dance floor, where Daniel was already waiting with an extended hand. As I watched them spin under the lights once again, I realized that the evening had come full circle. What began with an awkward name tag had turned into something much more meaningful. It reminded everyone present that generosity isn't measured by how loudly it's announced, but by how quietly it changes people's lives. And as the music continued to play and the vineyard filled with laughter, I felt certain that years from now, when Emily and Daniel told the story of their wedding day, they wouldn't remember the strange words printed on a small card. They would remember the love that surrounded them, the family that stood beside them, and the simple truth that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones given quietly, with nothing expected in return except the chance to see someone you love begin their happiest chapter.